it's fairly, I don't think it's particularly controversial to say that those threats and the actual violence would have been worse had people been able to bring their firearms to the events on that day. I think with that, I'll perhaps leave my opening comments and turn it over to the next speaker.
Thank you so much, Sam. As listeners will note, we've asked the speakers to keep the presentations brief today because we want to get to a lot of the Q&A as well. And I'll be moderating a bit just if questions don't come in. But please take advantage of that and use the Q&A function to send us questions. Next up, we have Jacana Thomas, who is an associate professor and a star of our department in the Department of Political Science at Michigan State University. She's also affiliated with the Center for Gender in the Global Context and is an expert on international terrorism, and we'll look at this more from a global perspective. Jacana.
Well, thank you for having me, and thank you for putting this forum together. And Sam, thanks for the remarks that you started with. A lot of these things were things that I was thinking about mentioning, but I won't because I think you did a great job in covering them. So in my, not as brief as your remarks, but I promise they will be brief, I'm going to talk about three main takeaways. Oh, sorry. Let's see. Excuse me. This is always a fun part. I'll talk about three main things. The main points that I'd like to make are that what we're seeing today is not new, right? We are not in new territory that's uncharted, and these are not events that have happened in isolation. We can kind of look to events in the past, even in the United States, to kind of understand what we're seeing today and what we're likely to see into the future. The second point I hope to emphasize is that there are potential warning signs for a broader problem. It's not, again, January 6th didn't happen in isolation, and that is not the most concerning thing or the only concerning thing that is likely on the horizon. And then the third thing, which I hopefully we'll talk about as a group, is there are some solutions in sight, and some of those are solutions that have been offered in the past by our government officials. So I'll start here by mentioning that in 2009, the Department of Homeland Security and the FBI did a threat assessment and was set to issue this as a draft report. And the basic idea was that there were issues in the current political climate that was fueling the resurgence and radicalization and recruitment of right-wing extremism. So keep in mind, this is from a decade ago or more than a decade. This draft report mentioned that right-wing extremists were likely to be gaining new recruits by what they said, playing on new fears about several emergent issues. I mean, these things that they thought were unique drivers of right-wing radicalism at the time in recruitment were the economic downturn, the election of our first Black president, new restrictions or perceived new restrictions on firearms, and the return of military veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan. And what was particularly concerning to the Homeland Security and FBI is that the political climate that we saw then was very similar to the climate that we saw in the 1990s, which saw the growth in right-wing domestic terrorism and extremist groups. So not just the groups, but the violence as well. And as we all know, in 1995, we saw the Oklahoma City bombing, which was prompted by some of these issues, which I'll talk about in just a minute. Also important to note is that they specifically talked about the fact that there were conspiracy theories involving things like declarations of martial law, civil strife, racial conflict, the suspension of the Constitution. These were things that they were seeing happening at the time, and they were linked to radicalization of domestic extremist groups and individuals in the past, including these Christian identity organizations, militia movements, and white supremacist movements. Also rhetoric that was inflamed in both the 1990s and the mid to late 2000s was talk about illegal immigrants that were taking away American jobs, and they specifically name dropped Mexico and Mexicans. And then right-wing extremists were also talking about, had adopted these issues of immigration as kind of their rallying point and recruitment call. Hopefully you'll notice that a lot of this sounds very familiar. In this report, they also talked about, this is from 2009, the concern of lone wolves and small cells, these groups that were small and therefore they were kind of hard to target, kind of hard to preempt. They talked about the potential threat of well-armed rural militias, and they pointed to several cases that the FBI investigated in Alabama, Arkansas, and Pennsylvania of these rural militias that were causing problems. And the last thing I'll mention on this report, well, not the last thing, but one of the last things, is that they also noted that a big part of what was driving this concern was the return of current and former military. And this is similar to what they saw after the first Gulf War in the 90s. And particularly, the Department of Homeland Security said that they were concerned that right-wing extremists were going to be able to recruit and radicalize returning veterans in order to boost their capacities, basically, and their capabilities. And this was bolstered by a report that the FBI had done the year prior that found that between 2001 and 2007, there were hundreds of military personnel and veterans that were active members in white supremacist groups. They mentioned that some of the biggest things that they were concerned about were the internet and other information age technologies that could facilitate extremists getting more information about tactics, like where to, how to recruit and train, bomb making. They were concerned about increasing networking among right-wing extremists. And lastly, they mentioned the fact that message encryption was possible, made it really hard for law enforcement to preempt these types of groups. And so their idea was that this is really concerning, but what happened in the 1990s and why we were able to see a decline in terrorism in the 1990s was increased government scrutiny after the Oklahoma City bombing. And so it wasn't until the government took an interest and was actually concerned about this specific type of activity that they sought abate. So what happened? Why are we here in 2019? Well, interestingly enough, although this report was put out by Daryl Johnson, who was a self-avowed Republican, conservative Mormon, it was framed as a political hit piece by the Obama administration. And specifically, Minority Leader John Boehner said that the Department of Homeland Security needed to apologize, and they basically needed to explain why we would call any Americans that returned home after defending their country terrorists, and why we would label any American citizens who disagreed with the Democrats as terrorists. So instead of thinking about the fact that these were like legitimate concerns, they thought of this as just like politically motivated. They forced the Department of Homeland Security to not only apologize, but to remove the report. They didn't retract it, but they removed it. And then this unit that was responsible for investigating was gutted. So that meant there were no further reports, and there was very little that they were able to do to actually staunch this kind of activity. So fast forward to 2020, the Department of Homeland Security under the Trump administration puts out another threat assessment that says that their biggest concern is going to be ideologically motivated lone wolves, small groups, same things that they said in 2009. And it's going to be these domestic extremists that were presenting the most lethal and violent threat. And particularly among the domestic violent extremists, the Department of Homeland Security pointed out that they were specifically concerned about white supremacist extremists. And this is mainly due to the data, right? And so this is actually a chart that they put in their report. And as we can see, homegrown violent extremists, those are the people who are radicalized from the United States and maybe radicalized toward Islam, is HVE, WSE, or white supremacist extremists, and then all of the other domestic violent extremists like militia groups are in the bottom. And as we can see from this chart, the most lethal groups in the United States between 2018 and 2019 were white supremacist extremists. The lethality doesn't even compare if you combine all the other categories together. So this is one reason why people have like honed in on these groups as potential areas of concern. Also note that this is before the election, before 2020. So this was a year and 2 years ago. In this threat assessment, they mentioned that there might be other domestic violent extremists that might become issues in the future, and these would possibly emerge around issues of immigration, environment, police-related policy issues, and obviously COVID-19 was going to be a massive factor exacerbating violence and insecurity. And they particularly mentioned that there might be increasing anti-government and anti-authority extremists coming from like because of the infringement upon civil liberties. And this would probably come from like some anarchies and militia groups. And so some of the takeaways are that the current climate that we are facing right now is very similar to what was identified in the 2009 report that was motivated by that 1990s as a case study. And we're experiencing economic tumult because of COVID. The election of progressive Democrats, namely the election of a mixed vice president, perceived and actual restrictions on firearms. Remember, these are some of the things that we were concerned about in 2009. And this is not unfounded because a political report from August 2019 found that 73% of Americans supported tighter gun regulations. And this number was 54% among Republicans. And so this idea that there's likely to be newer restrictions on firearms might undergird some of these concerns. Also, tensions around racial justice and immigration, technological advancements have only increased since 2009. And then finally, the radicalization among current and former military members is a major concern that has now become a concern of the government. And so in October 2020, there's been a lot of reports over the last couple of days about this Pentagon report that acknowledges the severity of the problem of radicalization in the military. And notably, the Secretary of Defense asked for a pause in January for everyone to consider how the military could tackle this concern of radicalization. And NPR did their own, digging and found that in the Capitol riot or the Capitol insurrection, nearly 1 in 5 defendants that were charged in the Capitol riots had served in the military. Now let's juxtapose this with the fact that only 7% of Americans have served in the military. So they are overrepresented in that number. And so these are the things that I think we're going to really have to take a hard look at and really think about. And what is important is how America is going to confront these inconvenient truths. So one important thing that I saw today that was just really fascinating to me was 100 evangelical leaders came out to condemn radicalized Christian nationalism today, saying that we don't like what we're seeing. We're seeing that Christianity is being co-opted by these militia members. And we actually have to take stock of this and condemn it if we're going to stop it. And we need more leaders of all stripes to come out and condemn this kind of behavior. And we specifically need the government to take a look at this growing extremism and take it seriously, unlike they did in 2009. And so I think we're at a turning point right now that if we do decide to take this stuff seriously, we might be able to quell some of this violence into the future. If not, we might continue to see this rise in extremism into the future. So I'll stop there. Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much. We're now pleased to have Dustin Carnahan, who's an assistant professor in the Department of Communication and affiliated with Health and Risk Communication in the College of Communication at Michigan State University. We know that there's also been increasing concern that online conspiracy theories and misinformation are helping to drive increasing political extremism, and Dustin's going to help update us on the research on the relationship.
Great, thank you so much, Matt, for the introduction. And I also want to thank Sam and Jacana in some respect, because I think they've done a nice job of kind of leading into what I'm going to talk about, which is the role of misinformation and conspiracies in fostering extremist viewpoints and ideology. As has been invoked before, right, January 6th and the events of that day were in many respects a manifestation of a lot of claims, a lot of conspiracies surrounding the outcome of the 2020 election that took place over many months. And it's easy to point to just that context and the election and rumors and falsehoods surrounding the election and saying this is why this happened. But actually, many of these conspiracies, many of these falsehoods percolated much earlier. And so in this talk, I want to talk a little bit about, or my introductory talk, I want to talk a little bit about kind of what does the evidence say? What do we know about the role of misinformation and conspiracies in fostering and promoting extremist types of ideologies and fostering greater polarization in society? To start in this regard, I want to start with a few quotes that have recently come out from scholars and experts who work in this area, who I think very, very neatly identify the problems that we're facing with regards to the information environment and the propensity of misinformation and conspiracies to foster some of these tendencies in terms of promoting extremism. Darrell West with the Brookings Institute, for example, points to the fact that it's very hard to identify common ground, to determine what we should be focusing on, agreeing on what the basics of reality are, when people are relying on their own assortment of facts, that they're existing really in many respects in parallel universes. But the thing is that if it's just a matter of differences of beliefs and differences of views, that alone doesn't sound so dissatisfying or so concerning. When this becomes a problem is when it starts to reinforce social identities, when it starts to create group divisions. And oftentimes when we see conspiracies form, as embodied by the quote by Joan Donovan, who works at Harvard University, her quote really points to the fact that falsehoods and conspiracies oftentimes are used to create this us versus them sort of ideology, similar to what Sam was talking about earlier with regards to discussing extremists in the forms of, like, for example, nativist groups, that oftentimes these conspiracies serve a purpose for communities and unite them around this agreement that there's this assortment of facts that this is the way reality is, and oftentimes paints an opponent in a negative way that creates these further divisions, these segmentations that then make it even harder for unity, for agreement, for even just a common basic basis of reality. But then going further, when we try to look at the manifestation of these tendencies, recent work has started to consider the extent to which misinformation and conspiracies can start fostering different types of behavioral outcomes, where we're talking about violence. And recent work has suggested that people who believe these conspiracies, again, it's not inconsequential. They're not less political. They're not expressing discontent with government. Instead, they're becoming less democratic in their perspective, and they're becoming more dangerous toward their propensity to act on these types of beliefs. But one thing to note, and I always start with this when I talk about misinformation and conspiracies, is that this isn't a problem that's new. I think Jacana did a really nice job, and Sam in their presentations of discussing how these types of tendencies have existed for decades. But what's happened in recent years is that social media has come along and really benefited the reach and capacity of disinformation campaigns and of individuals advancing conspiracies and achieving much greater reach of their views. We hear a lot about the echo chamber analogy with regards to the ability now for us to situate largely in very homogenous communities with people who share in many respects with our ideologies, with our beliefs and our values. And the primary concern here is that through these types of echo chambers, people can become far more extreme. They can become much more likely to believe that their perspective is the only perspective and that other perspectives, they're never coming into contact with them, which can start to promote and facilitate extremism. Furthermore, social media is being utilized by bad actors who are able to coordinate and network in ways that amplifies their content. And what we get from that is that now these perspectives that previously only reached fringe audiences are reaching mainstream audiences, are reaching millions of people. And many of these people are not equipped to handle this. They themselves don't necessarily have the requisite skills and literacy in order to navigate the information environment in ways that allow them to discern what is real and what is not. And so this also becomes a concern with media literacy, the ability of people to navigate the information environment in a way that is responsible. And we see this in some research that suggests that misinformation and conspiracies, specifically in recent years with Twitter and Facebook and other social media platforms, is reaching much greater audiences and much more quickly than traditional news, than true news. And this is just a figure from a recent paper that shows how fake news is much more viral. It reaches larger audiences much more quickly. When you look at the figure here, the green line indicates how far-reaching, how fast true news is reaching significant audience sizes, whereas the red line indicates how quickly and how far fake news and misinformation spreads. Again, I don't need to fixate on the specifics of the figure, but consistently, no matter which indicator we're using to determine how quickly or how far misinformation and conspiracies tend to spread online, they tend to reach a greater audience and go much more quickly than do traditional news and more reputable news outlets. And this has all inspired questions about where we're going next. And the concerns that are oftentimes voiced in this literature is that this problem may become more pervasive into the future because technological advances and more sophistication in the techniques deployed specifically by those who are nefariously trying to advance false narratives are growing. And the concerns around deepfakes, which are artificial intelligence programs that are made to create incredibly realistic looking videos that can make it appear that anyone or anybody is doing something, saying something that is inflammatory, offensive, that is just something that they never actually said or did. And so the concerns are that these problems are going to continue to grow. Now I want to talk a little bit about why people believe, because I think this is an important component of this as well. When you start talking about how this type of content can foster more radical and extreme perspectives. One reason you see people tend to believe this type of content is what we call the confirmation bias, which is the tendency of people to want to believe things that support an already existing worldview. When we encounter information that further affirms the things that we already have an inclination toward believing, we'll be far more accepting of that content, and we tend to reject content that tells us that we're wrong. And this type of tendency can result in us selectively attending to certain types of evidence that are affirming our belief, and we can see how that can facilitate further polarization and eventually perhaps even radicalization. We've already talked about the group dimension, and I think Sam and Jacana have talked to this already as well, that the group membership matters, that oftentimes we develop beliefs, we evaluate information in part based on how we perceive our group to think about these types of claims. We oftentimes will endorse certain types of claims to indicate our belongingness to the group. It's very important to us that we are not ostracized or in some way excommunicated from the group. And so we will engage in searches for information, engaging with different types of information, regardless of its veracity, as a means to affirm our membership in an existing group. Situations of ambiguity or uncertainty tend to be situations in which conspiracies and misinformation tend to take hold. When we are having trouble understanding what's going on, we will look to anything to help guide us. We do not enjoy being in a state of uncertainty. And so in those types of contexts, and I think we saw this quite significantly in the spring of 2020 involving COVID, people would gravitate to any explanation because there was so much uncertainty surrounding what was happening. And this opens us up to believing conspiracies and misinformation. A mistrust of mainstream news sources also makes people prone to get information online, which opens them up to the possibility of engaging with less than reputable news sources and perhaps following to a more significant degree the information that's posted by friends and other users on social media. Our emotions, we know, also can play a role in this process, especially anger, which can mitigate our ability to check and think reflectively on the types of content that we're engaging with. But also when groups and individuals feel powerless or ostracized in some way from society or disaffected, this is a situation in which we will oftentimes gravitate to conspiracies in order to explain and help us rationalize why we are in this state of powerlessness. So these are all reasons why we believe, and when we start moving into the next step, which is the link between conspiracies and misinformation on extremism, we see the tendency specifically of those responsible for disinformation campaigns and those who are advocating for these conspiracies. They recognize these tendencies in human behavior. They recognize our people's tendencies and their vulnerabilities, in a sense, to believe things that generally support them and their need to belong to groups and their feeling of powerlessness. And they push narratives and theories and ideas that specifically play to those tendencies. As a consequence of this, there's evidence that suggests that most of these types of efforts play to identity. They try to create some sort of community, some sort of common identity that these groups or that these individuals can coalesce around. And then oftentimes part of this identity is a focus on the political opponent. We see this rise in what we call negative partisanship in recent years, which means in a sense that it's less important the group that I belong to politically as much as it is that I just don't want the other group to win. And so the idea behind negative partisanship is much of what defines my own views is how much I dislike the other party. And this is particularly important when it comes to when your party or your preferred position is not in power. That this is when this activation of these feelings of this sense of this strong negative reaction toward the outgroup is stronger when you feel like they're imposing their will on you, that they're in a sense infringing on your ability to rise up out of whatever state you're in. And again, ultimately, the concern is that this is leading to a tendency where we're going to start seeing the manifestation of more political violence and extremist ideologies as a consequence of widespread belief in these types of claims and in these types of conspiracies. On this is a very developing field, so we're less than certain in terms of all of the types of potential outcomes here, but there is still early evidence that suggests that this concern is warranted. For one, misinformation and conspiracy belief is linked to a greater perception of distance between partisan groups. In other words, people who believe conspiracies tend to believe that those on the right are considerably different than those on the left. They don't recognize areas of commonality. They believe that the parties are largely more extreme than they really are. It also leads to exaggerations of the extent to which one believes that other people share in their belief in misinformation or these conspiracies. This can be attributed in part to the echo chamber concern, which is the idea that when all of the people who are immediately surrounding you are endorsing or supporting your viewpoint, you come to think that that view is more widely held, and that can form the basis of this perception that you are a member of this really significant community, which can tie back into this concern around the pull of the group. There's also this rise in what we call effective polarization, which is a jargony way of saying that people are expressing considerably more dislike and an intensity in this dislike towards members of the out party. Democrats are expressing increased levels of hostility towards Republicans, and Republicans are voicing increasingly negative perceptions of Democrats. It goes both directions. Effective polarization and is at its highest level, according to some studies in the past 30, 40 years. And this has been explicitly linked to belief in misinformation and conspiracies. And then more recently, we've seen some work that actually suggests that belief in conspiracies, belief in misinformation in many respects, because again, they're positing some sort of evil other force that is in some way shaping and manufacturing society in some respect that's undesirable, is actually associated with a greater tendency to endorse potential violent solutions, violent options in one's behavior. And so I want to conclude very briefly. I've already overstayed my welcome, but I do want to conclude very briefly with some opportunities, some things that we can do that we know will work. First and foremost, it's important to note that prevention strategies are far more effective than correction strategies. Once the damage is done, it's very hard to reverse that damage. So getting out ahead, and then by, for example, inoculating people, making them aware that these types of forces exist, and preparing them to how they should respond and react when they encounter these types of claims, it has been shown to be an effective way at preventing people from falling trap into believing conspiracies and misinformation. And this is actually very similar to certain types of anti-radicalization techniques that have been employed to fight against extremism in other contexts. Also, digital citizenship and information literacy, teaching people about how to navigate the internet in a responsible way, to identify the watermarks of reputable and disreputable sources. These are, again, ways that you can create people to at least reflect before endorsing and very quickly joining these types of movements and endorsing belief in these types of conspiracies. Minimizing the platform is another feature, another practice that has been floated a lot. We've seen this with deplatforming in recent years. There is evidence that suggests that when conspiracies appear or are perceived to be legitimized by political actors, that in a sense it suggests that it's okay to believe them. Deplatforming, again, the jury's still out, and there's significant concern about potential backlash effects involving censorship and involving perhaps emboldening individuals who are endorsing these views. So there's still some question, and there's not a lot of work that's been done in this respect, but it is something that is on the table, and we've seen increasingly adopted by social media platforms. And then to echo something Jacana concluded on, the idea of responsible leadership is key. That having officials in place and also leaders in power, not just in a political sense, but also in media companies, social media platforms, individuals who recognize the importance of not giving greater visibility to these types of claims than they deserve, and immediately distancing themselves from these types of conspiracies can go a long way to ultimately fighting back against this problem. So that's all I have. And again, thank you all so much for your attention.
Thank you so much. And we should have plenty of time for questions. So please be submitting them along the way as we discuss. I do want to start out with the first, which is as Dustin said, that we're seeing increased polarization on both sides of American politics. We're seeing some increasing willingness to endorse violence also on both sides, and yet, as Jacana said, the law enforcement and expert community is primarily concerned about an upsurge in actual violent activities on the political right. And as Sam said, that's sort of where the organized infrastructure is. So I guess why are we seeing this discrepancy? And to those who might equate, for example, some of this political violence with things like the civil unrest and riots over the summer and continuing in Portland, why is it that we get especially concerned about when this crosses over into attacks on the political system?
I'll jump in. So I'll first say that I think part of the answer is what Dustin has already talked about, and some of it is just disinformation. So the Armed Conflict Location Database, ACLID, just recently did a study on the crisis in the United States in 2020, and they pulled data on all of the events that occurred in during 2020, and they found data that there were 10,600 protests across America. And 95% of those protests, so 10,100 of them, were peaceful. Black Lives Matter movement constituted about 80% of those demonstrations. And they found specifically among those, 93% of those were nonviolent, right? But that hasn't stopped almost half of Americans, or something like 47% of Americans, thinking that these protests for social justice are largely violent, that their intention is to destroy and disrupt, even though that is actually not based in fact, right? The actual data suggests that they're mostly peaceful, yet and ACLID has suggested that it was based on concerted efforts and disinformation campaigns that are the reason why we have this perception that, the left is as violent as, what we saw at the Capitol, right? And so you hear this like, false equivalence that this is the same thing we've seen over the summer, but it isn't the same thing we've seen over the summer, because in fact, it's not, right? But then the second thing is, I think there are a couple of things to mention, and this is probably getting into the weeds of like a political violence scholar. When we think about riots, those tend to be disorganized, right? They're not organized attempts to subvert elections or to alter our political processes. They're kind of spur of the moment instances of violence, right? And we certainly did see that at the Capitol. There were some people who went there not intending to engage in any violence, totally expected to go and exercise their First Amendment rights, which are completely legitimate, and got caught up in a riot, right? And that is a different story than the Oath Keepers, and some of the other organized groups that planned and plotted. And, there have been investigations about this, and they intended to come and engage in violence. They were armed to the teeth, and some of the quotes that have come out was they were ready for war. And so, I think that part of the reason we have this perception that they're similar is because of these misinformation campaigns. Or disinformation campaigns, but they're not. But then I also think one thing that's important that Sam started us off with is there's a lot of heterogeneity in even what we saw at the Capitol, right? People came with different motivations, and people actually engaged in different behaviors, and lumping them all together does us a disservice, and it makes it hard for us to kind of even understand. And demonizing everybody that happened to be at the Capitol serves to delegitimize people who have legitimate grievances, right? Who are actually angry. And by just throwing out the baby with the bathwater in that regard, we don't get an opportunity to address what people were at the Capitol for and why they were upset. These legitimate actors who, were angry. And then, it further can further radicalize them by making them think that nobody's listening to them, right? Like they're being branded as these violent actors. And so, I think there are a couple of points to be made. One, the violence is not the same. And so, I think we should just stop, just even giving that kind of line of conversation legitimacy, because it's not. But then at the same time, there are so many different types of actors who are angry. And going back to like the economic climate, this perceived polarization, this idea that people cannot make effective change in the government through traditional and legitimate political activity, that's a concern, right? And again, that's fueled by these false narratives and this rhetoric that says that, you know, the election was stolen and that we can't participate in elections because they're not legitimate anymore. And so, I mean, all that to say, I think that it's important to recognize that there's a whole bunch of people, different types of people that created this coalition that we saw on January 6th that are strange bedfellows right now, and it may break apart this coalition, but right now there are a lot of different types of grievances and a lot of different reasons why we're seeing, you know, the right being the primary agitators in you know, political violence right now. And again, some of that is because of you know, these false narratives that are taking root. Some of it is just anger, which I'm happy to, we can all talk about later. I'll defer to my colleagues here. But I definitely think that it's important to note that, you know, that the left and the right, at least based on paper, what violence has already happened and what concerns the government seems to have right now, it is largely on the right, and these organized militias and organized domestic violent extremist groups, and those that are actively seeking to recruit among those disgruntled people, and some of them were at the Capitol.
So we've started to stimulate a lot of questions now, so that's good. So I think we'll just sort of let people can respond to what the other panelists say, but we'll throw some other questions in and see if we can get everybody in the conversation. So a related question that an anonymous attendee asked is whether this is a bottom-up process or a top-down process that's sort of stimulated by political elites.
Perhaps I could start with a few thoughts and pass it off to Dustin. See if I can perhaps even set him up to share some wisdom about things that I have questions about. I think I don't really know how helpful the top-down, bottom-up distinction is in helping us understand this. I think there is a feedback loop in many ways, especially if we think of leaders or elites, not just as political elites, but if we also think of media elites, let's say, who have very large platforms and can communicate with lots of people. You know, if I'm thinking about some of the media personalities who have been drivers of misinformation and disinformation and conspiracy theories, you know, they're driving this action. At the same time, they're responding to what they think their audience is tuning in for, or what they think their audience wants them to say, which is where it becomes difficult to say, is this being driven by elites or by bottom up from sort of everyday people? I mean, if you push me to talk about which I'm more concerned about, it's the elites who have the larger platform, who can communicate with a broader number of people. But I don't think it's really possible to fully detach the behavior of elites from the behavior of the masses, if we want to use that term.
And a related question for you, Dustin, is about whether this is the decline of the mainstream media and the rise in alternative voices that's given rise to this. Is this about our sort of lack of shared communication?
No, I think in some respects that's true. I don't know if I want to call it a decline. It's more of a reconceptualization, though. It's a process where mainstream media is learning to adapt and respond and figure out where their place is and what role they should play. But that said, there are studies that show a rather significant relationship between the decline in local journalism and the rise of misperceptions and conspiracy belief. This work suggests that, you know, especially on the local front, local news has always been held up in a higher regard. And I know, you know, there may be people out there who are happy to hear this, but local news is generally held up in very high regard in the minds of the public. The public trust it more to a greater extent than they do oftentimes in national outlets. And it provided a foundation for people to know what was going on in their communities. And in recent years, we've seen, you know, first off, the same trends towards conglomeration in local news and local journalism as we've seen elsewhere. But we've also seen just absolute funding emergencies in newsrooms throughout the country where they're unable to fill that void. And other actors are more than eager to step in and fill that space. And I think that's kind of the concern, is that you got to get your information somewhere. And if there is no respected and trusted outlets in your neighborhoods and your communities, that does introduce the possibility that that some of these forces, these more nefarious actors, are going to step in and they're going to fill that space. So I think it is a real question about kind of what this is going to look like moving forward.
And Jacana, we had a question about whether income inequality contributes to radicalization, and maybe I'll expand that a little bit and just say, what can we learn from these sort of global relationships between extremism and the characteristics of the socioeconomics and the society?
Yeah, so I think that income inequality definitely has a big effect on people's grievances. And we know that these these political entrepreneurs are able to seize on these grievances to recruit people. And so where people perceive that, for example, so earlier I mentioned that some of the concern in the early 90s and even in the 2000s surrounded things like free trade and offshoring of jobs to Mexico due to like signing NAFTA and then NAFTA going into effect. A lot of people were anxious and upset because they saw some of their jobs, right, disappearing. And so they were looking for another to blame. And these political entrepreneurs were able to point to that, right? That it is these free trade agreements, it is globalization, it is these politicians that are signing things like NAFTA into force that are taking away our jobs. And so therefore we have to, we have to fight against this, right? And so I think they're setting this up as a set of grievances that can be acted upon. And unfortunately, instead of saying, well, maybe we should elect some more politicians that would, alter NAFTA or, sign new types of free trade agreements, a lot of people say that there's nothing we can do except fight, right? That we have to fight against the Mexicans who are taking our jobs. We have to fight against the other immigrants who are coming in. And this enables people, again, to recruit. And so, yes, certainly income inequality is a big problem. I think generally the fact that wages are kind of stagnating and housing and other just basic goods are rising, those are big problems, and they've been exacerbated by COVID. And that was one of the things that the government was nervous about, right? That when people lost their jobs, when people, couldn't afford to pay their rent, how this might be preyed upon by violent political actors. And so, I mean, I guess looking towards solutions, it's really important that politicians govern, right? And that they actually take these types of concerns seriously, because not doing that enables violent actors to say, look, they don't even care about you. They don't, they're not a viable choice anymore. We now have to work outside of the system to take back what was taken from us, right? And this is the kind of rhetoric that we're hearing. And if they could actually deal with some of these issues, they could pull the rug from under some of these, at least out from under some of these claims, right? There'd be other claims that violent actors would use, but at least these wouldn't have as much, they wouldn't have as much of a pull, I think.
I think if I can just build off what Jacana is talking about here, I think sometimes we want to say, we want to look to economic forces as the direct driver themselves of extremism or radicalization. And I'm always wary of those kinds of claims. Instead, as Jacana was saying, it's really the perceptions of threats that are related to income inequality or globalization or other people taking our jobs that are drivers of these things. And this is reflected in a lot of research about who joins extremist and terrorist groups around the world. It's often not those who are most objectively economically disadvantaged. Instead, we see it happening with people who are relatively privileged in some of these precarious contexts, but who perhaps are not as well off as they anticipated that they would be, or they think that they have it good right now, but they see a bunch of threats over the horizon that they need to take action now to prevent. So I just want to repeat one more time that it's looking directly at the economic indicators themselves is often not enough and might give us a wrong impression. Instead, we need to think about the perceptions among people of those economic indicators.
Thanks. So we're making good time through the questions, so please keep submitting them, and we should be able to get to them. Dustin, you spoke about inoculation as a good strategy, and John is asking whether we can mitigate polarization and extremism early on in schools, perhaps in the media. So I guess what does that look like?
That's a great question. When you talk about it in the context of schools, obviously, that's a bit of a hornet's nest, in part because anytime you're changing policies in terms of how children are educated, you're going to get a rise out of one side or the other. But it's more so just, generally speaking, being aware of the form that these types of conspiracies take, right? That they play to the aggrieved. They create alternative explanations that explain, perhaps a powerless state that you find yourself. It's a strategic component to these types of appeals, and they try to rope you in, and they try to make you feel like you're not alone, and they try to build you into a community. And so in many respects, it's just some sort of, for example, media literacy campaign, or just mass effort to try to inform people of what these look like, and making them aware that that these are the types of attempts that you see that will try to suck you in, and why you should be wary of them, why you should be aware that these types of efforts and these types of actors exist. As for whether that takes place in schools or whether that takes place in some sort of public communication campaign, I think that's a decision that ultimately needs to be hammered out in legislatures, and determining what they're willing to bring in and what they're not. But as for whether or not it will decline polarization, I almost shared a research finding that just actually was released in the past few weeks, that suggested that taking people off of Facebook for even just 4 weeks reduces their level of polarization. And they paid participants to basically deactivate their accounts for 4 weeks, and it suggests that we're not too far gone. That if we're just more responsibly engaging, and we're keeping in mind of the fact that we're getting an algorithmically determined selection of the sources and posts by the people around us, that might make people at least recognize what's happening, and could perhaps at least open them up to the idea that they don't have to agree with the other side, but they don't necessarily have to hate them either.
Rex Lamore asked about the similarities with the behavior of these armed groups and law enforcement officers. And I know that Sam, you've closely studied a group that explicitly talks about their relationship to former law enforcement officers. So maybe you could take that one.
Sure. I think you also kind of teased my book subject, and then I didn't follow through on that tease. So I'll do that now a little bit. The book right over my shoulder there, in case anyone wants to buy a copy, is about a group called Oath Keepers, which is this group that I describe as a right-wing anti-government extremist organization. And one of their organizing principles is they want to encourage current and former law enforcement and military to do what the group describes as upholding their oath to defend the Constitution from enemies of the Constitution, foreign and domestic. And it just so happens that the group has focused primarily on domestic enemies. And so they have attempted to recruit law enforcement, and not just former, also current law enforcement. We've seen a number of cases over the past decade or so of police officers who have actually been disciplined because of wearing paraphernalia related to some of these anti-government extremist organizations, or adopting their rhetoric or symbols, or those sorts of things. But I think there's also this broader issue within law enforcement that perhaps makes them susceptible to some of these ideas about anti-government extremism. Thinking about how there are narratives of the police being this brotherhood that is facing a number of threats, and that needs to be ready to defend itself and fight off violence. If we're thinking about thin blue line rhetoric, it's the thin blue line keeping us away from a violent anarchic society. Or if we think about some of the iconography adopted by these groups, like the Punisher logo, this idea that violence is pervasive and we need to be ready to do whatever we need to, or whatever needs to be done to push back against that violence. I'm sort of rambling and tangenting off the question here a little bit, but I think it's worth considering actually some of the formal relationships as well between some of these groups and law enforcement. There are movements among anti-government extremist entities to try to do what they describe as an education campaign, especially with sheriffs, elected sheriffs in particular. They view elected sheriffs as the supreme law enforcement officer within their jurisdiction, um, saying that sheriffs have the legal and political authority and obligation to prevent other law enforcement agents, say, for example, an FBI agent, from carrying out law enforcement activity within their jurisdiction that they believe to be unconstitutional. And this has found purchase with law enforcement around the country in different contexts. I'm in upstate New York, and you don't have to go very far to find a county sheriff who believes that state level gun restriction legislation in New York is unconstitutional and therefore refuse to enforce that particular law. This is something that happens in other contexts as well with COVID mitigation policies that are viewed as infringements of liberty and won't be carried out. And I think that's a big problem that I don't necessarily have a solution for in any sort of concrete or short-term way.
Jacana, we have Christine asking about potential foreign influence in extremism, mentioning Russia and China. I know that that is often an issue in international context, but I also know that we sometimes like to blame things that are occurring domestically on foreign influence. So how should we think about that?
I wouldn't rule that out, right? That is some of what is happening on the media. I mean, on social media, that there are these foreign governments that are hoping to foment this kind of instability that we saw, right? I mean, I think that there is anecdotal evidence of that exact thing happening over like, over the summer, I guess last year, there were accounts supposedly linked to Black Lives Matter that were in fact linked to like Russian trolls that were kind of drumming up things. And so, I mean, I don't think that that is far-fetched at all. But at the same time, I don't think that that means that we get to escape any culpability here either. So, I think the ways that we've already talked about, well, I guess what Dustin has alluded to, the fact that there's media companies have responsibility to deal with social media. We have to accept that when we allow these companies to operate, this is the type of stuff that we're going to get, and it's going to have these downstream consequences, right? And so we can't necessarily rule out that people are being radicalized by fake actors, just the same way we can't rule out, it really makes no difference, right? The stories that the American extremists are telling us are also not true. And so at the end of the day, what we know is that people are being radicalized by disinformation campaigns, whether they're domestic, whether they're foreign. And I think that that's something that we have to figure out a way around. And again, this is not my area, so I'll defer to Dustin to give actual concrete suggestions on that.
I wouldn't say concrete, but I do just want to follow up on Jacana's point because absolutely, foreign actors have been involved, and we're aware of them. As a matter of fact, the government authorities have pinpointed a lot of activity in, for example, sowing discord, racial discord throughout the country, targeting both African Americans and whites throughout the country with messages attempting to disenfranchise them and disengage them from the political process, and in other instances, activating rage and anger toward other groups. And so we know that they're doing it. But I just wanted to share a little bit of additional context and based on my understanding of some of the work that's been done in this area. And that is that these actors oftentimes are not the ones who are initiating these claims. They oftentimes will amplify the claims. And what I mean by amplify is that they will boost them so that they can reach a larger audience through, for example, networks of trolls or bot accounts, these kind of coordinated efforts to take something that's already originated and push it to a larger audience. But we're responsible for the original content. They're not doing this on their own. We're feeding the beast. They may be making it reach a greater audience, but it starts with us. And so I think to Jacana's overall point, it does suggest that we have to acknowledge our own culpability.
John Lindstrom mentions that, of course, the attitudes that are sometimes being engendered by political leaders have electoral incentives, are responsive to electoral incentives, that there's sort of a reason why we want to make the other side look evil or to be a threat to the republic. And we sort of naturally react more when our side is losing, or we think that our side is losing a battle. So is there a way out of that cycle? See, I don't direct the hard questions to anyone, but then that makes everyone step back.
I guess to me, it just goes back again to responsible leadership, and there's ways you can. I mean, this is not to say that you can't criticize the out party. You can't, you are certainly within your rights to criticize the other party, but I'm reminded of the late John McCain in 2008, when he had an individual at a town hall who raised the specter of President Obama's citizenship. At which point John McCain stopped and said, "No, he's a good American. He's a good person who just happens to disagree with me." And I feel as if that kind of, again, feeds into the responsibility of leadership to certainly allow for criticism. And criticism is fair and welcomed, and it's needed. But this has become, I think when we talk about negative partisanship, this has become more about demonization, and the fact that, the out party is deviant and wrong, and they're irredeemable. And I think that's where we're heading. And that's, I think, the concern.
I'll just add to that a little bit, if I can. Ruth Bronstein is a sociologist at UConn who wrote a great book that I always forget the name of, Prophets and Patriots, or Patriots and Prophets. And she identifies this interpretation of American politics that was ascendant on the right in 2008 to 2010, let's say, that saw politics as a zone of conflict, and as this place where those you disagree with, they're not engaged in good faith disagreement with you. They are enemies. They are others who are out to harm you. And the response to that needs to be beating them at all costs. Instead, if we as citizens and as political leaders instead work hard to reframe politics as people who might disagree, but it's good faith disagreement that is seeking the public good, I think that can bring us back from some of the worst elements of this trend that we've experienced over the past decade in terms of seeing politics as irreducibly conflict.
Jacana, we got a question about observed generational differences in extremist attitudes, but I also want to, since we have the global expert on gender and political extremism, I want to also open that up as well. Obviously, these crowds have sometimes been seen as very male, but I know that that isn't always the case.
Those are both really hard questions. So I'll go with the second one first because it's easier for me. So I mean, I think that it's really important to note that although the last January 6th, we got so many so many headlines, there was such strong media reporting about how what happened was a symbol of white male rage, right? And I think one of the things that messaging gets wrong is that it's not just about white male rage. There are also women that are angry, right? Like look at some of the people from the Oath Keepers that were recently charged. One of the main instigators, I think her name is Jessica Watkins, she was a woman, right? And there were so many women that were complicit in the actual violence that took place and the organization that took place. There are women in these militia movements, and there have always been women in these far right militia movements. They prop them up, they support them, they engage in, they help them figure out the propaganda. And they've done this for decades and decades and decades. And so I think we often are quick to overlook the role of women. And I mean, some of it is about protecting women, right? And for whatever that's worth. But we often overlook the role of women in instigating violence. And I think that that's a problematic, that's erroneous, because if we're actually trying to figure out who's amplifying these messages, who's sending them, there was a recent report that talked about how the QAnon conspiracy theory is being pushed around by moms, by millennial moms with these really pretty Instagram worthy messages. It's basically pushing out conspiracy theories and propaganda, and it's gaining traction among the group of women my age, right? And so I guess these two things, I am actually answering them together. There is this momentum among millennials that are like, yes, QAnon, we're gonna figure this out. I'm a mom and I hate pedophilia, so this is my group, this is my lane, right? I'm a mom and I love Jesus, and therefore these Christian nationalist movements are my people. And so, I mean, I think that it's not just a movement of millennials, certainly not. Look at the crowd on January 6th. It was such a heterogeneous group of people. People from all walks of life were actually there. And so I think just trying to figure out if it's like, baby boomers or if it's millennials, that's not actually that helpful, because it's everybody, right? And I think there needs to be more work trying to understand how they've been able to make this messaging so attractive to so many different groups of people. And if we're going to try to combat it, figuring out how to disrupt those narratives. And what's fantastic, well, not in a good way, but it's surprising to me that there are just so many narratives that are somehow being stitched together in this neat little package. It's like, here, everyone who's aggrieved, this is for you. And I think that that's one of the reasons that this is different than what we've seen before, because this coalition is so broad, in that I don't actually know if there's a concrete solution or a concrete group of people to target here, because it's gained traction with so many different people.
Dustin, we've gotten a couple questions about the media. First, obviously, the maybe misalignment in incentives. The media companies want engagement. They don't necessarily find it easy to draw the line between misinformation and free speech. So how do they do that? And we had another question about media literacy, but I just sort of say, whose responsibility is that for people to be able to engage well with media? Is it the companies or somebody else?
I mean, this is the $1 million question that we're trying to answer right now. To what extent should the blame fall on the curators of the content that they're trying to customize and keep us engaged with these platforms? If the incentive is monetary, if the incentive is just ensuring that audience sizes remain high, then there's no incentive for them to worry about the quality of the information that people are situating themselves within. But again, this is why you see members of Congress who tend to take the perspective of this is the responsibility of media. When you hear about calls, for example, to repeal Section 230, and you're asking platforms to change the way they do business. And as a matter of fact, it's a good question, because yesterday there was a subcommittee hearing on Congress about the role of the media in filtering and slowing the spread of disinformation. And so it's an ongoing discussion in terms of who's ultimately responsible. Again, I think in many respects, social media are just playing to our own tendencies. These are the things that we are comfortable doing. These are the things that we want to do, and they're just playing on that. And if we demand something different, we'll get something different. But I think that's a challenge in and of itself, because you're asking people to operate and act in ways that they have learned over decades, and ways in which we're in many respects programmed to behave. And so asking people to, for example, spend time reading sources that differ from their perspectives, and take more time to validate and ensure that the things that they're seeing are true and real, is asking them to do things that they've never had to do before, and perhaps come as a discomfort to them. And so in terms of my own personal view, I think the focus on the platforms themselves and the ways in which they've been programmed is really the primary problem. And then the question becomes, what can we do about it? And on that, unfortunately, I don't have a great answer.
So I do want to make sure we get to Lauren's related question, since we have this audience of state legislators and staff. What can they actually do? Michigan has in some ways been a long time hotbed of political extremism. What is under their control that they can do both in their public acts and in policy, if possible?
I mean, I'm aware of at least one legislative effort from a few years ago that has attempted to implement a sort of media literacy training in classrooms that, in many respects mirrors some of the types of training you get with regards to online security involving stranger danger, where students learn about, being concerned and skeptical of people misrepresenting who they are, and applying a similar sort of training with regards to how to successfully and critically navigate the internet and determining what's true and what's not. And again, this doesn't have to be partisan. We see conspiracies and misinformation surrounding health and science and any number of different topics that can simply just create more critical consumers. I am aware that that effort did not ultimately pass, but I think that would be a fantastic start, is establishing just a baseline level of competence and literacy in classrooms, and perhaps additional investment in communication campaigns and public outreach efforts. When we talk about generational differences and Chicana's response, it reminded me of research that suggests that this is a problem that is in many respects largely affects older people, older citizens, because they didn't grow up with these types of platforms at their fingertips, and thus they are learning a new technology on the fly when younger generations have had this experience. And so things like outreach campaigns, investment in efforts to promote more thoughtful and reflective engagement with media among certain populations, I think could be two concrete suggestions of things that can be done.
Chicana, I know that you've said before that there's sometimes a trade-off here between conventional political activity and this political extremism. And so I guess I wonder on that side, what political officials can do. I mean, do they need to reinforce that the electoral process is still, their side can still win, other means of political action?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. So my first suggestion would definitely be that legislators can reinforce that the traditional politics are still a viable means of change, right? We don't have to resort to unconventional politics. We don't have to resort to violent politics, extremist politics, because there's nothing really fundamentally wrong and broken with our political system. And I think one of the most important parts that politicians in general, not just in Michigan, but in general can do is tell the truth, right? And it's important to be honest and upfront about, actual claims about election integrity in states and cities and at the national level, because part of what's fueling this is people's belief that, something is being taken from them. And I think convincing them and actually being upfront and saying, look, we lost this and that sucked and we didn't like that, but it doesn't mean we'll lose every time. We can do something better the next time, and working and putting effort into, I'm not a Republican strategist, and I'm certainly not a person who is going to tell them how to win the next election. However, I do think that is a role that legislators can play, that here are some concrete strategies that we can do, that we can take to do better during an electoral process. And so basically restoring faith in the electoral process, in elections themselves, in elected officials. Those are really, really important things that cannot be understated. And going back to just disinformation, one thing that we know about disinformation is that, it doesn't matter how much fact checking is done by the other side, as long as the people, your trusted representatives and the people that you trust to give you information continuously, tell you that something is true that is not, your perception will never change. So people are more likely to believe the information from people that they trust. And so although, we can imagine that there's been lots of efforts from both sides, but mainly the Democratic side, by saying, "Oh, the election was not stolen; there was integrity." It doesn't matter, right? That doesn't matter. It needs to be Republicans that say, "Hey, look, this election was not stolen. it was fair. It wasn't what we wanted, but it was fair, because that's the only way that we could actually really combat that specific type of misinformation. I think the second point that I would make on your question is that we can't also underestimate the value of actual traditional law enforcement, right? We can't turn a blind eye to the organization and the activities of militia movements. It's just, we can't do it, because by doing so, and this is what we've learned from other countries and civil wars in other countries, where these movements flourish is where there are opportunities for them to flourish. When authorities are not, combating them, when authorities are not present and they're up in the Upper Peninsula training, these are the places that, from global experience, this is where this type of activity can thrive. And so one solution is just to make sure and to be really vigilant about the rise in militia movements and these violent actors. This is a job for law enforcement. And so I think there are multiple strategies that we can take to kind of approach this problem. And as Dustin has already highlighted, the media also plays a role, and therefore legislators have a role in, maybe having more conversations, more hearings on the role of the media in current politics. And I think having those kinds of conversations will maybe help us come up with some new solutions that don't make the government, I'm not suggesting government mandating or changing or legislating the behavior of Facebooks and Instagrams of the world, but I think that they need to be held accountable in some way.
So Sam, we also had a question about extremism in among your own family and friends. I know that this might be even harder than advice to legislators, but what should people do if they see this happening in their own social networks? Is it sort of too late, or is there a way to use the personal ties?
That's a great question. And unfortunately, I wish I knew more about this. I am sometimes a little bit of a defeatist when I'm asked to provide solutions for this sort of thing, just because of gaps in my own knowledge. I think one of the things that experts have found is that adopting an empathetic posture regarding these people tends to be more effective than adopting a hostile posture. So, for example, if you have an uncle who's espousing QAnon conspiracy theories, you don't say, "Wow, that's crazy that you believe all of this nonsense." Instead, you say things like, "Where did you hear that? What do you think this is really about? What's the evidence that you have? Talk me through how you came to believe these things." And presenting them with information that challenges those narratives that they've been presented with. I think we also can't discount the role that socialization plays in a lot of extremism. A lot of work on various forms of extremism, especially in the US, going back decades. I'm thinking about work from Kathleen Blee, who studied white supremacy in the US for decades. She and others have found that a lot of the routes into various forms of extremism are social ties, not ideology. That the ideology actually follows after you've already joined groups and movements, as you're exposed to information more and more, and begin to adopt it. So perhaps that suggests that one mechanism or one route out of this form of extremism or belief in conspiracy theories is also the socialization. At some point, in some situations, cutting ties with a family member might be appropriate. But in other situations, it might be that the person is feeling isolated or detached from the family or something like that, and that providing them with more opportunities for engagement in that family setting, it could actually play a positive role. I don't want to hit that point too hard because I don't know if there's evidence for it, but it seems logically consistent to me.
Dustin, Shanna is asking about incentives to stay off social media. You mentioned, I think, that they could work. Should we be thinking more broadly about being more active about changing people's information diets, and are there other examples of success?
That was the first time I had seen a study of that nature. It was very innovative in its approach. But I think maybe I want to flip the question around and say, in times like these, we're all inside, we're all stuck. It's Michigan, it's winter, it's COVID. These are the dangerous times. And I think this is when you can see extremists and these types of conspiratorial beliefs kind of rise. It's because and I think Jacana even made the point about the Instagram moms. And I think this is fed into the Instagram moms as well, that, people have more free time. And in that free time, they are, gravitating to things that, aren't necessarily rooted in reality and can ultimately foster extremist views. In terms of some sort of mass incentive program to get people to turn off Facebook, if that was possible, I would have done it long ago. Personally, I would have signed up for that. But I don't know how that would look, but I think it just highlights the danger that when people are engaged on these outlets, that potential will always be there. And when we have circumstances like we have now, I think the lesson from that study, in my view, is that we have to be aware this can be happening in plain view. And we need to be thinking about ways in which we can, again, make people cautious and aware of the pigeonholes they can ultimately find themselves, especially when we're feeling more isolated, we're inside, our free time is up, our stress level is high, our anger and emotions may be, in disarray. That these are the very moments when, being online, being on Facebook could increase that tendency, increase that, proclivity toward extremism even more. And so that's the way I look at it. And again, if you have an innovative solution to pay people to get off Facebook, I say go for it. But that's just for personal reasons.
Jacana, we're about to run out of time, but we had a question about your comparing this period to the 1990s and just thinking about what are we in a period where we should be especially worried about extremism, fascism, changes to our form of government, or is this sort of a repeating historical pattern?
I mean, I think the fact that it is a repeating historical pattern is why we should be worried, right? Because this is what has happened before. And so we have evidence that, I mean, there's always this American exceptionalism. So like if we pointed to what happens in other countries, people would, well, we're America, it's different. But if we look at America as precedent, we can say that these were dangerous times for us when we saw these things align. This is likely to be dangerous times for us. And then they're amplified by some of the things that we're talking about today, right? The ability of people to network and communicate on social media in a way that they never were before. The ability to access training from other violent organizations, obviously the election, the increased polarization, all of the COVID, all of these things are exacerbating the tensions beyond what we saw in the 2000s. And I mean, possibly beyond what we saw in the 1990s. And I mean, going back to this point about the military. So Trump promised that by May 2021, all the troops are going to be gone from Afghanistan. If one of our concerns is increasing radicalization and the return home of military members, and as it was in the 1990s after the first Gulf War, and then 2000s after the war on terror, this is something that might be also concerning if we don't really check it now, right? All of these people coming home in this highly polarized environment. Of course, this is not to demonize the military at all. There are so many wonderful veterans that have served our country. However, we do know that they have the capacity, they have the skills, they have the training, and they are unfortunately susceptible to recruitment by these violent non-state actors. And so I would say, yes, this is a time where we should be worried, and because there were times like this where we were worried and for good cause. And I think January 6th was an example of why we should be worried, right? This is not it. This is just kind of like showing us that this is what could happen and this is what could continue to happen. And so in short, yes, I think that there's definitely cause to be concerned based on the patterns that we've seen in the past.
Well, we'll have to end there, but I thank everybody for their participation. And I'm sorry we didn't get to all of the questions, but I think all the panelists are available for follow-ups if people have questions. And I hope some people go out and pick up a copy of Oath Keepers and keep learning more. And join us next time. We'll have a few policy forums remaining in this spring. So thank you for participating, and we look forward to seeing you again.